Politics in the 1920s and the Great Depression. The election of 1920. The Republicans nominated Warren G. Harding of Ohio, with Calvin Coolidge as his vice president. They avoided Wilson's solid referendum, or call on the voters to decide ultimately on our participation in the League of Nations. Part of the reason that Warren G. Harding was chosen is that the platform that he stood upon was effectively ambiguous on the issue of the League of Nations. Another reason that he was nominated by the Republicans has to do with the election of 1920 being the first time that full suffrage for women in a national election was in place. The Republicans considered Harding to be handsome and thought that would sway female voters. Harding spoke of returning America to normalcy. The conservative old guard wing of the Republicans now dominated the party, as Teddy Roosevelt and his progressive followers had bolted in 1912. The Democrats nominated James M. Cox of Ohio, who strongly supported the League of Nations. The result, Harding defeats Cox, 404 to 127 in the Electoral College. Eugene V. Debs ran as a socialist and received the largest number of votes for the Socialist Party's history. 919,000 people voted for Eugene V. Debs while he was sitting in jail. He was jailed for violation of the Sedition Acts during World War I. The results displayed the public desire for a change from idealism, moral overstrain, and self-sacrifice. They had given up so much in World War I and just wanted to go back to normalcy. The isolationist turned the results into a death sentence for the League of Nations. The domestic aftermath of World War I, the War Industries Board was dismantled. The Esch-Cummins Transportation Act of 1920 returned private management of the railroads and encouraged railroads to consolidate. The Interstate Commerce Commission pledged to guarantee the profitability of railroads. Reformers had hoped that railroads would be nationalized, an old populist idea that never happened. Race riots also occur. They're spurred by black migration to northern cities during the war, or the Great Migration. The most notable of these race riots was the Chicago Race Riot of 1919. However, other riots occur in Knoxville, Omaha, Washington, and other major cities. The Veterans Bureau was created by Congress in 1921. They were authorized to operate hospitals and provide vocational rehabilitation for disabled veterans. The American Legion was also founded in Paris in 1919 by Colonel Theodore Roosevelt Jr. Known for its militant patriotism, conservatism, and anti-radicalism, they lobbied aggressively for veterans' benefits. The Red Scare in late 1919 and the early 1920 was aimed against radicals and unions and showed the country's disdain for anything foreign and anything associated with anarchism or communism. Harding's administration was one filled with scandal. His cabinet became known as the Ohio Gang, or the Poker Cabinet. Harding appointed his friends to prominent positions in his cabinet and used his connections with them to make money in some instances. Harding is considered by many historians to be one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. Colonel Charles R. Forbes, who was head of the Veterans Bureau, and his accomplices looted the government of about $200 million, mostly in connection with the building of veterans' hospitals. The Teapot Dome Scandal. In 1921, Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, arranged the transfer of valuable naval oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California, to the Department of the Interior. Harding indiscreetly signed the secret order. Fall then leased the lands to two oilmen and received a bribe of about $400,000. The scandal became public in 1923, and the three men were indicted in 1924, but the case was not resolved until 1929. The scandals that emerged during Harding's administration and afterwards undermined Americans' faith in the courts and in public officials. His Attorney General, Harry Daugherty, was brought to the under Senate investigation for the illegal sale of pardons and liquor permits. He was forced to resign and brought to trial in 1927, but twice the jury fails to convict him. Several of his advisors committed suicide rather than face the humiliation for corruption. Harding would die in San Francisco on August 2, 1923, while on a speech-making tour. No one is sure what his cause of death was. Some believed that his wife killed him due to his indiscretions. He had bore a child out of wedlock and was known to have affairs on his wife. Others believe that the stress of all of the corruption of his administration coming to light led to his untimely demise. Whatever the case, when he died, Vice President Calvin Coolidge took the reins of the presidency. The talented members of Harding's cabinet stayed in place. Charles Evans Hughes, the Secretary of State. Andrew W. Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury. Herbert Hoover, the Secretary of Commerce. The Republican Old Guard dominated Harding's administration. Harding's conservative agenda. The conservatives, or the Old Guard Republicans, believed the role of government was to make business more profitable. Tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy led to trickle-down economics, or were fed by the idea of trickle-down economics. This trickle-down economics theory was advocated by the Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who favored rapid expansion of capital investment. The premise behind trickle-down economics is that high taxes would force investors to invest in tax-exempt securities, rather than in factories that provided economic growth. So, Mellon engineered a series of tax cuts, implemented from 1921 to 1926. The belief was that if they cut the taxes for the wealthy and for business, that they would spend their money on goods and services, and eventually that money would trickle down into the lower ranks of the economy, rather than be hidden away in tax-exempt securities. As a result of these tax cuts, much of the tax burden shifted to the middle class. The Republican Old Guard also put in place higher tariffs. The Fordney-Macomber Tariff of 1922 was put in place to try and prevent cheap goods from Europe from flooding into the United States. Businesses feared that the cheap goods would flood in as a result of Europe trying to recover from the war. So tariff rates were pushed from 27% under the Underwood Tariff to an average of 38.5%, almost as high as the Payne-Aldrich Tariff of 1909. Duties on farm produce were also increased. The President authorized, with the advice of a fact-finding tariff commission, to increase duties by as much as 50%. The impact of these decisions? Europeans' post-World War I economic recovery was impeded by high tariffs limiting their trade. Europeans, as a result, had more trouble paying back the huge debt that they owed to the U.S. In retaliation for the high tariffs, they put in retaliatory tariff measures against the U.S. goods, which hurt U.S. manufacturers. High European tariffs also hurt neighboring Europeans. The idea of laissez-faire economics, or that the government role should be limited and should stay out of business, was one that was very popular in the 1920s. Less government regulation was something that Harding and other Old Guard Republicans supported. Harding appointed people to regulate agencies that didn't like regulation. The government helped to facilitate monopolies and the consolidation of industries. Antitrust laws were often ignored, circumvented, or inadequately enforced by Daugherty's friendly prosecutors in the Attorney General office. Industrialists set up trade associations where an industry would agree upon standardization of a product, publicity campaigns, and a united front in dealing with other industries and customers. Businessmen should run the government as they had experience in management was the belief promoted by these Old Guard Republicans. They rejected federal government programs to help ordinary citizens. Many conservatives believe that local communities and charity should take the responsibility for helping those in need. This would be Herbert Hoover's philosophy during the Depression. Under Harding's administration, he also made conservative appointments to the Supreme Court. Harding appointed 4 Supreme Court justices in his less than 3 years as president. Judges were reactionary and held back reforms for nearly 2 decades. The exception to this was William H. Taft, who was made the Chief Justice. He was relatively liberal. The court killed a federal child labor law, stripped away many of labor's gains, and restricted government intervention in the economy. The Harding administration was also hostile to unions. They reacted to the 1919 Seattle General Strike, the Boston Police Strike, the United Mine Workers Strike in 1919, and numerous others. Membership in labor unions dropped by nearly 30% between 1920 and 1930. In 1922, the Railway Labor Board ordered a 12% wage cut, provoking a 2-month-long strike. They also reduced the national debt by making the government smaller under Harding's administration. The national debt had increased from $1.2 billion in 1914 to about $24 billion in 1921, largely the costs of funding World War I. The Bureau of Budget, created by Congress in 1921 to reduce the national debt, and the Secretary of Treasury, Andrew Mellon, reduced the national debt by about $10 billion, from about $26 billion altogether to about $16. Foreign policy under Harding and Coolidge. We wanted to return to isolationism after World War I. Isolationists, in effect, signed the death sentence for the League of Nations by refusing to sign the League Covenant and the Treaty of Versailles. Later, the U.S. would bear part of the blame for World War II, as it undercut the League of Nations by refusing to join it. The security treaty with France was also rejected by the Senate. The U.S. thus spurned an opportunity to emerge as a world leader and to shape world events for the benefit of peace. In July of 1921, Congress passed a simple joint resolution declaring World War I officially over. The Senate refused to adhere to the World Court, the judicial arm of the League of Nations. The Washington Disarmament Conference, 1921 and 1922. The threats to peace were a naval arms race shaping up between the U.S., Britain, and Japan. The long-standing Anglo-Japanese alliance obligated Britain to aid Japan in the event of a Japanese war with the U.S. The conference was set to tackle naval disarmament and the situation in the Far East. In February of 1922, the 5-Power Treaty was signed. Hughes proposed an existing 5-5-3 battleship ratio, with the U.S. and Britain receiving 5 ships for every 3 Japanese ships. Italy and France would receive 1.75 ships each, though I don't know how you sail 3/4 of a ship. In return, Japan received guarantees that the U.S. and Britain would refrain from fortifying their far eastern territories, including the Philippines. The building of new battleships would be banned for 10 years. This power treaty would replace the Anglo-Japanese alliance. Then, in 1922, the 9-Power Treaty, which preserved the open door in China among the 9 signatories. However, there were loopholes in the treaties meant to keep peace. There were no restrictions on small warships, which resulted in other powers constructing cruisers, destroyers, submarines, while the U.S. lagged dangerously behind. Congress declared it was making no commitment to the use of armed force or any kind of joint action when it ratified the 4-Power Treaty. Intervention in the Caribbean and Central America. The U.S. troops were removed from the Dominican Republic in 1924 after 8 years. They remained in Haiti from 1914 to 1934. Coolidge removed forces from Nicaragua in 1925 that were there since 1909, but sent 5,000 troops back in 1926, who remained until 1933 after the U.S. had placed Anastasio Somoza in power. In Mexico, Mexico had made its oil fields public and said that U.S. companies could not own them for the next 50 years. Coolidge directed Dwight D. Morrow, a prominent international banker, to settle the situation without resorting to war. So Mexico agreed to allow pre-1917 companies to keep their oil fields in Mexico. The Clark Memorandum in 1928, the Secretary of State, J. Reuben Clark, pledged the U.S. would never intervene in Latin American affairs in order to protect U.S. property rights. This rebuked the Roosevelt corollary that the U.S. would intervene for its own defense. Loans and reparations. The U.S. emerged from World War I as a creditor nation and demanded repayment. The British and French protested demands of repayment as unfair, as they had sacrificed their youth in the war for victory. Debtors also complained that the effect of their loans had fueled the American economy, as U.S. products and services were bought. U.S. tariffs were making it impossible for them to sell goods and earn the money necessary to repay their debts. The Allied demands on Germany. France and Britain demanded Germany make enormous reparations payments, totaling about $32 billion for war damages. France sent troops into Germany's industrialized Ruhr Valley in 1923. Berlin responded by allowing its currency to inflate astronomically, to the point where the Deutschmark was useless. Coolidge refused a debt cancellation. So the Dawes Plan was put into effect in 1924. The Dawes Plan rescheduled German reparations payments and opened the way for further American private loans to Germany. The U.S. loans helped Germany repay France and Britain, who in turn paid back the U.S. for their debts. In other words, the money went in a circle. Wall Street bankers gave private loans to Germany. Germany made reparations payments to France and Great Britain. France and Great Britain used those reparation payments to pay back the Allied war debts to the U.S. Treasury. So all of the money used to repay the war debts actually started in the United States. We essentially moved the loans from one place to another. U.S. credit continued to help with the financial issue in Europe until the crash of 1929. The U.S. policies harbored ill will among European nations towards the U.S. The Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928. Growing unrest in Europe due to a slumping economy and Japan's aggressive moves against China concerned democratic countries, including the U.S. and France. The eventual agreement, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, was ratified by 62 nations. The Kellogg-Briand Pact made war illegal, except for defensive purposes. The major flaw of the Kellogg-Briand Pact was that there was no enforcement mechanism, so while we said war was illegal, there was nothing to stop war from happening. It gave Americans a false sense of security in the 1930s. The two main causes for the failure of peace will be the Great Depression and war psychosis in Europe. Calvin Coolidge's presidency. Coolidge carried out Harding's conservative programs. One of the problems he faced was the farming problem. The causes were the recovery of European farmers brought less demand for U.S. farm products, and machines facilitated more food production, but increased supply meant a decrease in food prices. A depression hit the agricultural sector in the 1920s, as 25% of farms were sold for debt or taxes. The McNary-Hagan Bill, proposed from 1924 to 1928 by a bipartisan congressional farm bloc from agricultural states, aimed to help farmers. It sought to keep agricultural prices high by authorizing the government to buy up surpluses and sell them abroad. Government losses would be made up by a special tax on farmers. Coolidge vetoed this bill twice. As a result, farm prices stayed down, and disgruntled farmers sought to make a difference in the 1924 elections. The election of 1924. The Republicans nominate Calvin Coolidge. The Democrats nominated a conservative businessman, John W. Davis, and the New Progressive Party nominated Senator Robert Lafayette, Fighting Bob Lafayette. Coolidge defeated Davis and Lafayette by large margins. Lafayette did receive nearly 5 million votes, but the nation was too prosperous for most to be overly concerned with progressive reforms. Muscle Shoals, Alabama. During World War I, the government had constructed a dam and 2 nitrate plants on the Tennessee River at Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Both Harding and Coolidge opposed progressive plans for federal development of hydroelectric generating stations on the Tennessee River. Senator George Norris wanted the project owned and controlled by the government. Republicans saw that as being socialistic. The proposal would have significantly improved the economic plight of the Tennessee Valley region, and Muscle Shoals became the nucleus of the New Deal's Tennessee Valley Authority in the 1930s. The election of 1928. Herbert Hoover is nominated by the Republicans on a platform of prosperity and prohibition. Alfred E. Smith is nominated by the Democrats. The election of 1928. For the first time, the radio was used significantly in campaigning. Hoover decreed un-American socialism and preached rugged individualism. Religious bigotry was displayed over Smith's Catholicism. Because Smith was a Catholic, it hurt his chances of being elected. The results? Hoover defeated Smith by huge margins, 444 to 87 in the Electoral College. A huge Republican majority was returned to the House of Representatives in 1928 as well. Hoover's presidency. Herbert Hoover organized food drives for starving people in Belgium during World War I. His leadership of the Food Administration during World War I earned him the titles of the Great Engineer and Wonder Boy. He was a prototypical businessman who disliked socialism or large-scale government intervention in the economy. As Secretary of Commerce, he supported some progressive ideas, for example, endorsing labor unions and supporting federal regulation of new radio broadcasting. He claimed in 1928 that poverty will be banished from the nation. The Great Crash of 1929 proved Hoover incorrect. The bull market in the 1920s continued up until the crash. One of the reasons that leads to the crash was that people were allowed to buy stocks on margin. In other words, they were buying stocks on credit. Investors purchased stocks from stockbrokers for as little as 5% down. When their stock values rose, which they did through most of the 20s, investors would pay back their debt. If the prices of the stock decreased more than 10%, the broker would sell the stock for whatever price they could get. Banks also loaned money to stockbrokers to facilitate the buying on margin. So you have people buying money on credit with the expectation that it'll increase in value. If it fails to increase in value, though, these people have no way to repay their debts. On top of buying on margin, there's also over-speculation taking place in the stock market. Investors gambled that prices would continue to rise. Artificial rises in stock and commodity values fueled speculation. Hoover unsuccessfully tried to curb speculation through the Federal Reserve Board. It didn't work. October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday as it has come to be known, everybody wanted to sell, and within hours, the stock market crashed. By mid-November, billions of dollars in stock value had disappeared. Traditional historical interpretation puts the crash as the immediate cause of the Great Depression. By 1932, 5,761 banks had failed. It's 22% of the total number of banks. Now, at this point in American history, there is no FDIC, So if the bank that you had your money in failed, everything that you had in that bank disappeared. You never got it back. Thousands of businesses also failed. Unemployment reached 25% by 1932, which is extremely high. If you include farmers into that number, unemployment was nearly 33%. The city of Chicago had 50% unemployment. That means half of the people in the city did not have a job. Low-skilled workers were the most susceptible. Professionals and middle-class workers suffered less. Total wages dropped from $12 billion to $7 billion from 1929 to 1932. By 1932, 25% of farmers lost their farms. People experienced loss of self-worth. Many families broke apart. The marriage rate and birth rate declined. 3 million people became hobos and lived in makeshift shacks known as Hoovervilles because they blamed Hoover for the Depression. Malnutrition was rampant in certain areas, but death by starvation was uncommon. The Depression was the longest and most devastating in U.S. and world history. Amongst the industrialized nations, the U.S. was hit hardest. International reparations and war debts, the structure of which collapsed, U.S. exports dropped, further hurting the U.S. economy. The long-term causes of the Great Depression. Weak industries. The cotton industry was affected by the rise of synthetic materials. The railroad industry was affected by the automobile. Low food prices were affected by the farming industry. The demand for foodstuffs had dropped after World War I, and when the government refused price supports in the 1920s, it left farmers nearly incapable of turning a profit. Overproduction of goods by manufacturers was also a major problem, that coupled with underconsumption. Consumers began to spend less on goods. Underconsumption. Many warehouses full of products that couldn't be sold. As a result, companies lost money. There was also an uneven distribution of wealth. 5% of the population received 30% of the total income. One estimate said that the income of the top 1% increased about 75%, while the bottom only 6%. There were also low wages for industrial workers and farmers. 1/2 of the country lived below the poverty line. These were potential customers, unable to buy because they couldn't afford to based upon their wages. Finally, there was an unstable banking system. Due to mismanagement and overspeculation, 1% of the banks controlled 46% of the bank's resources. And weak international economies. The protectionist trade policies that stopped foreign trade, like the Haley-Smoot tariff, created an international economy that was prone to failure. Hoover's response to the Great Depression. Hoover believed that outside forces in Europe were responsible for the Great Depression. He thought it was an economic consequence of World War I, that post-war military alliances and the doubling of pre-war armaments, inflationary public works programs to alleviate unemployment, unbalanced budget, and increasing debt. Hoover thus took too long to initiate domestic measures to help the economy, believing instead the international system had to be repaired. He took a very hands-off approach. In the farming sector, before the crash, the Agricultural Marketing Act was passed by Congress in June of 1929. It was designed to help farmers help themselves, largely through producers' cooperatives. The Federal Farm Board, which was established in 1930, with a revolving fund of about $500 million. The money was lent to the farm organizations seeking to buy, sell, and store agricultural surpluses. The goal, to increase sagging prices by buying up surpluses. The Haley-Smoot Tariff of 1930. The tariff became the highest peacetime barrier in the nation's history. Foreign governments interpreted the tariff as an economic declaration of war. This exacerbated the existing economic depression by limiting international trade. International financial chaos resulted in the U.S., and the U.S. became even more isolationist. Hoover believed that economic recovery would only happen through work. Volunteerism. Hoover believed that voluntary cooperation, like the voluntary cooperation that existed in World War I, would enable the country to weather the Depression. He urged businesses to avoid layoffs of workers and wage cuts. He secured no strike pledges from labor leaders. He urged all citizens to contribute to charities to ease the suffering. In reality, private charity was not adequate to reach the country's needs. They needed the help of the government. In 1930, Congress appropriated $750 million for public buildings, river and harbor improvements, and highway construction in an effort to stimulate employment. These public works projects were supposed to put people back to work. Hoover Dam was begun in 1930 and completed in 1936, and is the largest public works program begun during the Hoover administration. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC, was created by Congress in 1932. The RFC had appropriation of $500 million and the authority to borrow $1.5 billion for loans to railroads, banks, and other financial institutions. Later, they approved legislation authorizing the RFC to lend $300 million to states for relief and to make loans to states and cities for self-liquidating public works. It prevented the failure of basic firms on which many other elements of the economy depended, but it was criticized by some as relief only for the rich. The Norris-LaGuardia Anti-Injunction Act of 1932 was passed by Congress and signed by Hoover. It outlawed yellow dog or anti-union contracts and forbade the federal courts to issue injunctions to restrain strikes, boycotts, and peaceful picketing. The refusal for relief was driven by the idea of rugged individualism. Hoover opposed the vetoed use of federal funds for relief for the needy. He compromised by authorizing the RFC to lend $300 million to the states for relief and to make loans to states and cities for self-liquidating public works. Hoover believed in rugged individualism and pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. He had made himself a millionaire and thought that through hard work, the people of the country would fight their way out of the Depression. There was a moratorium on international debts put into place in 1931. Hoover courageously pushed for a one-year freeze on international debts to help European countries, especially Germany, recover. Yet, the international economy was too heavily damaged for this to make much of a difference. The Bonus Army. 14,000 unemployed veterans marched on Washington in the summer of 1932 to lobby Congress for payment of bonuses approved in 1932, but not payable until 1945. At Hoover's insistence, the Senate did not pass the bonus bill, and about half of the Bonus Army accepted congressional transportation home. The remaining 5,000 to 6,000 lived in shanties along the Anacostia River and lobbied for their cause. Hoover called in the army to remove the Bonus Army after 2 veterans were killed in a clash with police. The significance: Hoover appeared heartless to already angry Americans, and it contributed to his defeat in the November elections. He forced out veterans who simply wanted the bonus that they had been approved for early to help them through the Depression by use of the armed forces. Foreign policy during Hoover's presidency. Japanese attack on Manchuria in September of 1931. The open door shut as the Western world was reeling in economic chaos. It violated the League of Nations Covenant as well as other international agreements signed earlier by the Japanese government. The League of Nations condemned the action by the Japanese. As a result, Japan left the League of Nations. Hoover, reflecting isolationism of the nation, wanted no part in military action against the Far East. The U.S. was severely handicapped by the Depression. Further, they had severely handicapped the League of Nations by not taking part in it. The Hoover-Stimson Doctrine of 1932 declared that the U.S. would not recognize any territorial acquisitions that were achieved by force. Japan was infuriated as the U.S. had conquered territories a few decades earlier, but they were not deterred. They bombed Shanghai in 1932 with appalling losses to civilians. Japanese aggression was seen by many historians as the beginning of World War II. The naked aggression was not halted by the League of Nations, and Hitler and Mussolini would soon bring Europe to war. The good neighbor policy. Hoover aimed to abandon an interventionist philosophy of Theodore Roosevelt. He took a goodwill trip after his election in 1928 of Latin American countries aboard a U.S. battleship. The Great Depression meant less money for U.S. investors to spend overseas, thus decreasing U.S. interest in economic imperialism. In 1932, he negotiated a new treaty with Haiti, which provided for later withdrawal of U.S. troops in 1934. In early 1933, U.S. forces left Nicaragua after an unwelcome stay of nearly 20 years.